Frederick Seddon, his wife Margaret, and their 5 children lived at number 63 Tollington Park in the North London borough of Islington. There was nothing terribly remarkable about them. They were an attractive family, and both parents were industrious, hard-working, if a little preoccupied with money. But when a middle-aged woman died in their house in September of 1911, it led to one of the most sensational murder trials of the 20th century. It is often said that of all murderers who use arsenic to ply their trade, there is none so mean, so mercenary, or so calculating as Frederick Seddon. But that is only a half-truth, as I intend to show. Seddon was a very egotistical, enormously self-confident, ambitious man. But hubris, as the ancients knew very well, brings nemesis.
Ernest van der Aar had not heard from his cousin Eliza Barrow for a few weeks. Although they weren't on the best of terms, owing to the difficult and often mercurial character of Eliza, they nevertheless tried to keep in touch. On the 20th of September 1911, it being a pleasant evening and Miss Barrow living only about a quarter of a mile from his own house, Ernest van der Aar decided to stroll over to her lodgings at 63 Tollington Park, Islington, London, and pay his regards. He arrived there at about 8:20 p.m. and rang the bell. It was answered by a servant called Mary Chater. "I've come to see how Miss Barrow is getting on," he told her. Mary Chater looked astonished. "Haven't you heard?" she said. "Miss Barrow is dead and buried." Ernest van der Aar stood and stared. "When did she die?" he asked. "Last Thursday." "But this is only Wednesday," he said incredulously. "She was buried on Saturday," said Mary Chater. She told him that the landlord and house owner, Mr. Seddon, was presently out, but if Mr. van der Aar called later, he would be able to explain all. A shocked Ernest van der Aar returned to his home at nearby 31 Nevershot Road and told his wife the news. After some discussion, the two returned to Tollington Park, arriving at about 9 p.m. Frederick Seddon was still absent, but his 15-year-old daughter Maggie saw them. She could give them no details of their cousin's death or illness, and they left in a state of some disquiet. It should not be imagined that the van der Aars were deeply distressed by a much-loved cousin's death, or even that they kept in touch with her periodically out of a sense of familial duty. Miss Barrow was a difficult woman. She had no friends at all to speak of, because she was quick to take offence and fell out with everyone, generally sooner rather than later. And she had a vituperative temper too, when riled. She had once spat in the face of Mrs. van der Aar, and the latter was said to have described Eliza Barrow later as being a wicked woman. Their interest in Miss Barrow was largely pecuniary. She had money, and they were her nearest, if not her dearest. They had expectations, and they knew that sooner or later her worldly possessions would come to them. But Eliza Barrow was only 49 at the time of her death, was in good health, and they had little expectation of obtaining her fortune at any time soon. But this turn of events changed things. If she had died without a will, and there was every reason to believe she had, then they stood to inherit a large sum of money. Eliza Mary Barrow was born in Islington, London, in 1862. Her father was a pub landlord who had run the Mortimer Arms in Tottenham Court Road, and then later the Prince of Wales pub in Kentish Town. After the death of her parents, she inherited property in the form of the Buck's Head public house in Camden Town and a barber shop next door. She also inherited a large sum of money, which allowed her to live as a woman of independent means. For all this, she was an abstemious woman, and dressed shabbily according to those who knew her. In fact, Eliza Barrow was a miser. She liked to count her money and keep it close. She rarely spent any, and when she did, it was only out of necessity. She seemed to move from one set of modest lodgings to another, probably because she quarrelled with her landlord so frequently, and was easily provoked. In 1905 she lodged with a Mrs. Grant, and when the latter died in 1908, she took responsibility for her daughter Hilda, who was sent away to school, and her son Ernest, whom she informally adopted. She and Ernest, called Ernie, had lodged for about 10 months with her cousin Ernest von der Haar in 1909 and 1910 for 30 shillings a week, until the inevitable happened. They fell out. After this, she and Ernie took rooms at the top of 63 Tollington Park for 12 shillings a week, which was owned by Frederick Seddon and his wife Margaret. It was a good deal. The 12 shillings rent was very modest, and the Seddons seemed ideal landlords. They were very attentive to her. The daughter Maggie cooked her meals and cleaned the 4 rooms she had taken for 1 shilling a day, and Frederick Seddon was ever ready to assist and advise with her financial arrangements. He was a man of business, had a bluff attitude, and a quick native grasp of financial matters, and she came to trust him. Then, at the beginning of September 1911, she became ill. There was an epidemic of diarrhoea in London, probably due to the hot summer and an infestation of flies which accompanied it. Mrs. Seddon called in a Dr. Henry Swan, who had little doubt from the symptoms Eliza Barrow exhibited that she had succumbed to the malady which had become so familiar to him in his parish. He prescribed bismuth and morphine, and made several visits during the following days, during which Eliza Barrow seemed to improve in symptoms a little, although he had concerns at her general weakness. Then, on the morning of the 14th of September, Frederick Seddon appeared at his door, and informed Dr. Swan that Miss Eliza Barrow had died at 6 a.m. that morning. Having attended her throughout her illness, he had no doubt that the cause of her death was due to heart failure, as a result of the enteric infection from which she was suffering. He therefore wrote out a death certificate there and then, and handed it to Seddon, stating that Miss Barrow's death was caused by epidemic diarrhoea. Although she had only died on the Thursday morning, Seddon visited a funeral parlour, and arranged for Eliza's funeral to be held in 2 days' time. She was buried in a common grave at Islington Borough Cemetery for a knockdown price of £3, 7 shillings and 6pence. And Frederick Seddon, ever a man of business, negotiated a commission for himself of 12 shillings and 6pence on this. Thus it was that by the following Wednesday, when Ernest von der Haar came to call on his cousin, he was astonished to learn that she was dead and buried without any of the family being aware of it. The 2 Mrs. von der Haars visited 63 Tollington Park the morning after Ernest von der Haar's visit, and the 15-year-old daughter, Maggie Seddon, again answered the door. They were shown into the dining room, and after a long wait, Frederick Seddon and his wife Margaret appeared. Seddon was self-assured, even to the point of brusqueness. His little eyes regarded them with mild disdain, but Mrs. Seddon seemed to be nervous. Seddon took charge of the situation at once. He informed the 2 ladies that he was a busy man and could spare them little time. As though to emphasize this, he removed his pocket watch and consulted it. One of the Mrs. von der Haars noticed with some consternation that it was remarkably similar to one owned by Miss Eliza Barrow. She also noticed that Mrs. Seddon was wearing a pendant which was identical to one belonging to Miss Barrow. Frederick Seddon seemed to be prepared for this visit. He gave them a carbon copy of a letter addressed to Ernest von der Haar informing him of Miss Barrow's death, which he told them had been sent on the day of her death, but they said they hadn't received it. The letter read, Dear Sir, I sincerely regret to have to inform you of the death of your cousin, Miss Eliza Mary Barrow, at 6 a.m. this morning from epidemic diarrhea. The funeral will take place on Saturday next, about 1 to 2 p.m. I must also inform you that she made a will on the 11th inst, leaving what she died possessed of to Hilda and Ernest Grant, and appointed myself as sole executor under the will. Yours respectfully, F. H. Seddon. With great self-possession and some alacrity, he placed the letter, the funeral card, and a copy of the will into a large envelope, and presented it to the ladies. It was an act of peremptory dismissal. The two ladies, decidedly unhappy, asked if Seddon would see Ernest van der Haar to discuss the matter further with him. He said, "I'm a businessman, and I think I've wasted quite enough time on this matter. I really can't be bothered answering questions put by inquisitive people." This bluff and officious response took them aback. It seemed beyond mere discourtesy, but there was little they could do. The two ladies left, disappointed. Their conversation, as they made their way back to Evershot Road, can only be imagined. But suspicions once rooted are hard to dislodge, and suspicions there were in the many family meetings which took place in the weeks which followed. They knew something of Miss Barrow's wealth, and the fact that Eliza had made a will drawn up by Frederick Seddon himself, rather than by a solicitor, and in which he was named as sole executor, seemed suspicious. Seddon was absent for 2 weeks following his meeting with the two van der Haar wives, taking a break in Southend. But on his return to 63 Tollington Park, he was visited by Ernest van der Haar. Seddon at once adopted the same high-handed, superior attitude towards him which seemed to be his stock in trade in dealing with people whom he regarded as being his inferior, which was most people. Van der Haar had to wait 20 minutes in the dining-room before Seddon attended to him. When he appeared in the company of his wife, he was smoking a large cigar. "Now, what is all this about? You are under the impression that some money is due to you from the estate of Miss Barrow? The will is perfectly clear. I don't see why I should give you any further information. If your solicitor cares to see my solicitor, all very well and good." In spite of this attempt to subdue him, Ernest van der Haar asked him a direct question, meeting Seddon on his own terms. "Who is the owner of the Buck's Head?" he asked. "I am," said Seddon, returning his gaze unfalteringly. Seddon had clearly decided that a direct challenge was to be met with equal force. "And the barber shop next door is also mine. I bought the property. In fact, I am always open to buy property if it shows any chance of a reasonable return." Ernest van der Haar then inquired why Miss Barrow had been buried in a common grave when a family vault existed in Highgate, to which he was entitled. Seddon said he thought the vault was full up. He refused further discussion of the matter concerning Eliza Barrow's estate, inviting van der Haar to consult a solicitor if dissatisfied. Van der Haar's attempts to assert himself into the matter of his cousin's estate had been met with Seddon's bluff dismissal. There seemed to be a stalemate. There was little the van der Haars could do. Seddon believed, in his own mind at least, that he had put an end to the matter. But he was mistaken. The van der Haars nursed their wrath to keep it warm. There were numerous family meetings, and at last they decided to go to the police with their suspicions. The police received the information from the van der Haars with courtesy and examined it as a matter of routine. Such complaints by relatives, bilked of what they regard as being their rightful inheritance, are not uncommon, and, of course, they rarely amount to anything. But this case was different. It was quickly appreciated by Detective Chief Inspector Alfred Ward, who had charge of the investigation, that this matter warranted further inquiry. The haste with which Miss Barrow had been buried without her relations' knowledge was unusual. The fact that this had all been managed by her landlord, Frederick Seddon, who was also sole executor of her will, and who had seemingly acquired, by one means or another, all her wealth, gave cause for concern. Of course, none of this meant that there had been foul play, and the police proceeded with the greatest caution. They looked into the circumstances and made discreet inquiries concerning Frederick Seddon. He was born in 1872 in Liverpool. At the age of 19, he began working for the London and Manchester Industrial Assurance Company. His diligence was quickly rewarded. In 1896, he was made district superintendent, and in 1901, superintendent for the Islington district. In 1893, at the age of 21, he had married Mary Ann Jones, whose family lived in the same street as the Seddons, Priory Street, in Liverpool. They had 5 children, the eldest being 16 and the youngest being 9 months old at the time of Eliza Barrow's death. Seddon earned about £300 per year in salary and commission. That's approximately £36,000 in 2020 terms. And he had a number of other streams of revenue also. The Seddons were a relatively prosperous and hard-working family, a family on the up. Seddon was an eloquently preacher on Sundays and a Freemason. He was on his way to becoming a pillar of the community. The police inquired into the intricacies of MissBarrows' financial arrangements. They looked also at those of Frederick Seddon, and discovered that Seddon had benefited considerably by Eliza Barrow's death. Miss Barrow had £1,600, approximately £190,000 in 2020 terms, in 3.5% India stock, which he had transferred to Frederick Seddon in exchange for an annuity of £10 per month. And this, it was learned, would cease on her death. She also had a large bank balance of £216 and a post office account with other funds, all of which had been withdrawn in the past year and had disappeared. A cash box, which was known to contain at least £400 in gold and notes, had only £4 and 10 shillings in it at the time of her death. All in all, she had been worth at least £4,000, which equates to something like £500,000 in today's terms. And yet, at the time of her death, it seems she had just £16 remaining. Police interviewed the doctor who had attended Miss Barrow and who had issued her death certificate. And after doing so, and having regard to all the circumstances, a decision was taken to request of the Home Secretary that he make an order for the exhumation of Eliza Barrow's body, so that further tests could be conducted into the cause of her death. The body of Miss Barrow was exhumed in great secrecy from its common grave at Islington Cemetery in the early hours of the 15th of November, in the presence of toxicologist Sir William Wilcox and the young pathologist Bernard Spilsbury. It was taken to Finchley Mortuary, where a post-mortem was carried out, and major organs were removed and sent to St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington for analysis. Here Wilcox discovered that these contained a large quantity of arsenic. Eliza Barrow had died of acute arsenical poisoning. Of course, Seddon knew nothing of any of this, and must have imagined by early November that the matter was long settled. But he was in for a shock. On the evening of the 22nd of November 1911, Seddon was, as ever, working at his insurance accounts in the basement office at his home in Tollington Place, when his daughter Maggie showed a policeman in. He handed Seddon a piece of paper. "I am the coroner's officer," he said. "This is a summons for you to attend an inquest on the body of Eliza Barrow, which will be held tomorrow." What thoughts must have raced through Seddon's quick and busy mind at this point are not known. But in the morning he was grey and haggard. The inquest under the Central Middlesex coroner, Dr. George Cohen, went poorly for him. The questions for which he had calculated all the answers, in whose confidence he had upbraided Vanderar that his solicitor would handle any challenge, did not satisfy the court. The coroner wanted to know what had happened to the considerable sum known to be kept in the cash box, and to other money Miss Barrow was known to keep. He asked some searching questions of Seddon concerning the property Miss Barrow had owned, and which he had exchanged for the annuity with him. The coroner asked, how much was she getting from the house in rent? £155 a year, Seddon told him. And you promised to give her £52 a year. For life. The lease had only 16 or 17 years to run. It has 18.5 years to run. Would it bring in £120 clear? I dare say it would. Then for £120 you were going to give her £52. I have brought my own business ability into play. Quite so, said the incredulous coroner. The fact that Miss Barrow had been poisoned by arsenic, had made a will just 3 days before her death, placing Seddon in full control of those assets which had not mysteriously disappeared already, his involvement in her financial affairs, the obvious suspicion that he had appropriated her wealth, his conduct and the circumstances of Miss Barrow's sudden and unceremonious burial in the absence of any relations, led to a logical and reasonable suspicion that Frederick Seddon had murdered Eliza Barrow. But there was no proof of this, and the coroner's jury gave its verdict as one of wilful murder against person or persons unknown. At 7 o'clock on the evening of the 4th of December 1911, Frederick Seddon was approached in the street at Tollington Park by Detective Chief Inspector Ward, accompanied by 2 detective sergeants. They seized his arms, and he was arrested for the wilful murder of Eliza Barrow. When told of the charge, Seddon replied, "Absurd! What a terrible charge! Wilful murder? Are you going to arrest my wife as well? Have they found arsenic in her body?" He was then taken to Hornsey Road Police Station, where he was formally charged. Detective Chief Inspector Ward searched 63 Tollington Park in the presence of Mrs. Seddon. He found a ring, a gold chain and pendant in Seddon's safe, plus gold sovereigns. A gold watch and chain was also found in the bedroom wardrobe, and when questioned about this, Mrs. Seddon said it was hers, but on further questioning said that Miss Barrow had given it to her as a present. Police inquiries revealed that the 15-year-old daughter, Maggie Seddon, had purchased a packet of 6 arsenic-laced flypapers from Thorley's chemist on the 26th of August, just 6 days before Miss Barrow became ill, and Mrs. Seddon had purchased more of these from Meacher's chemist on the 4th of September. In doing so, both had specifically requested the ones which are soaked in water, rather than the harmless, sticky flypapers. It was also discovered that Mrs. Seddon had cashed in 27 £5 open cheques belonging to Miss Barrow, often using a false name and address, and had escorted Miss Barrow to the bank for the purpose of withdrawing £216 in gold sovereigns, which had then disappeared. Furthermore, it was noted from the statements made by the doctor, the servant Mary Chater, and by the Seddons themselves, that Mrs. Margaret Seddon appeared to have had exclusive care of Eliza Barrow from the 1st to the 14th of September, the period covering that of her illness and death. At 5 p.m. on the 15th of January 1912, Mrs. Margaret Seddon was also arrested and charged with wilful murder. The trial of Frederick and Margaret Seddon began at the Old Bailey on the 4th of March 1912 before Judge Thomas Bucknell. The Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs, appeared for the Crown, and Edward Marshall Hall and Gervais Rentoul appeared for Frederick Seddon and Margaret Seddon respectively. The prosecution case was that only the Seddons benefited from the death of Miss Barrow. The Seddon and his wife had gained full control over Miss Barrow's affairs, that they had systematically relieved her of her fortune and had gone to considerable lengths to conceal the matter of her death from her family. They had even sent her ward, Ernie Grant, away to Southend immediately following her death, because he attended the same school as the Van der Haas children, and they feared they might learn of her death by this means. Seddon's guilt, said the Attorney General, was indicated by his attempts to conceal her death and his taking pains to ensure that her family was unable to investigate the circumstances of her illness and death. Seddon's motive, said the Attorney General, was that he was an unscrupulous operator, obsessed with money and the acquisition of wealth. For her part, Mrs. Seddon had likewise been responsible for stripping Miss Barrow of her wealth by cashing £5 Treasury notes under a false name and address, and by accompanying Miss Barrow to withdraw £216 in gold from the bank. She had procured some of the flypapers in early September, her daughter procuring the others on her behalf, for the specific purpose of poisoning Miss Barrow. Each flypaper of itself contains sufficient arsenic to kill an adult, and it could be extracted from the flypaper quite easily by soaking it in water for 48 hours. The court heard from various witnesses, from a Mr. Hook, who claimed that the Seddons had sought to estrange Miss Barrow from his wife and himself for the purpose of isolating her, from 2 employees of the London and Manchester Assurance Company, by whom Frederick Seddon had been seen counting a large sum of gold in their presence. And evidence was heard that Seddon had banked an amount of money which corresponded to that which Miss Barrow was believed to have had in her cash-box only days after her death. The undertaker gave evidence of the nature of the arrangements made for the burial of Miss Barrow, and, of course, the Van der Haas gave accounts of their conversations with Seddon and his wife. The defence for Frederick Seddon, conducted by Marshal Hall, averred that all Seddon's money was accounted for. He was a businessman and had a float of cash which he kept in his safe. The annuity arrangement with Miss Barrow was a perfectly legitimate transaction, done at Miss Barrow's behest. The will was drawn up at Miss Barrow's request also, because she was ill and had no means of calling a solicitor, but was anxious to see that the 2 children she had assumed responsibility for were left her possessions. In fact, all Seddon's actions had been proper and legal. Furthermore, if arsenic had been administered to Miss Barrow, and there had been an epidemic of diarrhoea in London that summer, then there was no evidence whatsoever to show that Seddon had purchased or administered it. In fact, he had never been alone in Eliza Barrow's company, and so had little or no opportunity of doing so. Walter Thorley, the chemist, had been mistaken in his identification of Maggie Seddon as the girl who bought the flypapers on the 26th of August, and the jewellery and watch were gifts from Miss Barrow, who was an eccentric woman, given to fits of temper and also generosity. Marshal Hall worked hard to introduce uncertainty and sufficient doubt into the matter. If poison was administered, he said, could it not have been anyone in the household who had administered it? He tried to cast suspicion on the servant Mary Chater, suggesting that her brother was a lunatic, that she, as a nurse, knew a great deal about poisons and might possess a touch of insanity herself. All this was, of course, hotly denied by an indignant Mary Chater, and its purpose was simply one of obfuscation, to introduce doubt into every aspect of the evidence heard in court. Gervais Rentoul associated himself with Marshal Hall's excellent advocacy, and pointed out that there was even less evidence against Mrs. Seddon. Marshal Hall advised Frederick Seddon not to take the witness stand. He had misgivings about allowing the Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs, to probe his actions and motives before a jury, and he was concerned at the unfavourable impression Seddon might have on the jury. If the evidence does not convict the man, his conceit will, he remarked to a colleague. But Seddon, with characteristic confidence in his own abilities, his vanity flattered at the prospect of being cross-examined by the Attorney General himself, insisted that he appear. It was a grave error. When Sir Rufus Isaacs rose to cross-examine Seddon, he quickly revealed how deadly his style of questioning would prove to be. Speaking quietly and with unfailing courtesy, the Attorney General opened with a disconcerting line of questioning. Miss Barrow lived with you from the 26th of July till the morning of the 14th of September, 1911, he asked. Yes, said Seddon. Did you like her? Did I like her? Yes, that's the question. Seddon could hardly say yes, because the pauper's burial he had arranged for her would prove him a hypocrite and liar. But if he said no, he would risk turning the jury against him. At last he said, She was not a woman that you could be in love with, but I sympathized deeply with her. Then, during the time she was living with you at your house, did you advise her on her financial affairs? Yes, certainly I did. The Attorney General then meticulously ran through all the property and wealth Miss Barrow had possessed when she arrived at the Seddons' house on the 26th of July, 1910, amounting to a value of some £4,000 in total. And then he asked Seddon to confirm if it was the case that just 1 year later, on the day she died, everything she possessed, including her clothes and furniture, came to a total value of £16, 14 shillings and sixpence. The effect of this was devastating. It was exposed to all that Frederick Seddon's financial advice to Miss Barrow had been, at the very least, catastrophic to her financial well-being. Seddon was clever. He did the best he could to counter the effect of this, but the Attorney General, courteous and relentless in all his questions, was clearly getting the better of him. At one point, when disputing the words Chief Inspector Ward had attributed to him on his arrest, Seddon cried, "I swear before God that these are the words that took place." "All the statements that you are making," replied the Attorney General with quiet admonition, "are statements before God." Seddon's claims not to know where Miss Barrow's wealth had gone were not at all believable, nor were his frequent claims that he advised Miss Barrow to consult a solicitor, only to have her insist that she would do without one. His suggestion that Miss Barrow may have drunk the water from the saucers which contained the flypapers was, of course, regarded as absurd. Mrs. Seddon, who also appeared in the witness box, was subdued. She claims she did not know what had happened to the £216 Miss Barrow had withdrawn, nor to have known why she needed it. She claimed that the £5 cheque she had cashed for Miss Barrow were at Miss Barrow's request, and that the pendant, chain, and other jewellery had been given by Miss Barrow to herself and her daughter by Miss Barrow's presence. She did, however, elicit considerable sympathy in court due to the subdued manner in which she gave her evidence, and also to her occasional breakdowns. Her manner was in marked contrast to that of her husband. The judge's summing up was notably benign towards Mrs. Seddon. "I know full well you must have sympathetic feelings for the female who stands charged with the wilful murder of another female," he said, and he intimated that there could be an element of doubt in the case of Mrs. Seddon. The jury retired at 4 p.m. and was out for 1 hour and 5 minutes. Upon its return, it gave its verdict as guilty against Frederick Seddon, but not guilty for Margaret Seddon. Frederick Seddon turned and embraced and kissed his wife, and she left the dock a free woman. Her sobbing could be heard as she left the side door, and the court settled for the next matter in hand, the sentencing of Frederick Seddon. The clerk of the arraigns then put the traditional question to Seddon. "What have you to say that the court should not give judgment for you to die in accordance with the law?" he asked. It was now that there occurred an extraordinary scene. Seddon made a speech lasting for a quarter of an hour, attacking shortcomings in the prosecution case, criticising the judge's summing up, and even his own counsel's deficiencies. He concluded by turning to the judge, and in doing so he raised his hand, taking the Freemason's oath, and said, "I declare before the great architect of the universe that I am not guilty, my lord." Only those who were Freemasons would have understood what had occurred in the reference Seddon made to the great architect, and the sign he made before the judge. Seddon was a Freemason. So was Judge Thomas Bucknell. Bucknell understood the meaning, and that Seddon was requesting the urgent help of a brother Mason in extremis. It was an astonishing act. Bucknell was visibly distressed as he sat at the bench. The court watched in thrilled anticipation. The usher called for complete silence. A chaplain entered quietly and discreetly and stood to the judge's left side. The doors of the court were locked. No one could now enter or leave until sentence had been passed. Struggling to recover his composure, Bucknell, wiping his eyes and with great emotion, said, "It is not for me to harrow your feelings. Try to make peace with your Maker. We both belong to the same brotherhood, and though that can have no influence with me, this is painful beyond words to have to say what I am saying. But our brotherhood does not encourage crime. It condemns it." The judge's secretary at his side placed the black cap on the judge's head, and in a faltering voice, Justice Bucknell pronounced the sentence of death upon Frederick Seddon. Seddon was then removed to Pentonville Prison to await execution. His appeal was heard on the 1st of April 1912 before Mr. Justice Darling, and was denied. His request for clemency having been denied also, he was informed on the 16th of April that sentence would be carried out in 2 days' time. His wife and eldest son visited him at Pentonville Prison on Wednesday afternoon, the day prior to his execution, and he took his leave of them. And it was here that he was hanged, at 9 a.m. on the 18th of April 1912. The tolling of the bell at 9:05 a.m. and a notice pinned to the door of the prison signalled to those without that execution had been carried out in accordance with the law. An inquest was held soon afterwards within the prison walls, at which his 16-year-old son, looking understandably shaken, and his tearful father identified the body. There can be little doubt that Frederick Seddon was guilty of the murder of Miss Eliza Barrow in September 1911, nor of the fact that this act was the natural consequence of his having systematically defrauded her of around £4,000. There were only 4 people who could possibly have committed the murder by administering arsenic to Miss Barrow. The 10-year-old son, Ernie Grant, the 15-year-old daughter, Maggie Seddon, or Frederick and his wife, Margaret Seddon. But of these, only Seddon and his wife stood to benefit by her death. Only the Seddons had displayed in all their actions towards Miss Barrow a mercenary zeal to divest her of everything she possessed. The course they had embarked upon could have only one outcome. Because they had swindled her, there would be consequences from that, whose avoidance would require the most extreme remedy: her murder. It was a supreme irony, of course, that the will Seddon had drawn up for her, leaving all her worldly possessions to the 2 children, so framed that it would divert suspicion from the fact of how utterly depleted her wealth was, became one of the most damning documents against him. Because the will was an empty document, Miss Barrow had been cleaned out by the Seddons. It was a simple distraction designed to give the impression that she had left her wealth to the 2 children for whom she had taken responsibility, when in fact there was no wealth left to bequeath. Less than £20 remained, of which £4 had been spent on her funeral. The will was an act of concealment to prevent further inquiry by her relations, to conceal the motive and thereby the fact of her murder. Seddon had taken the steps necessary to conceal Eliza Barrow's death by visiting the doctor, by expediting the funeral, by carefully depriving the relatives of the possibility of second-guessing the cause of death until after she was buried, at which point only an order from the Home Secretary could effect her exhumation. But it must also be said that his enormous confidence, which had served him so well in his business and in all the transactions of his life hitherto, was also his undoing. His confidence, that characteristic arrogance, his belief that his assertive, intimidatory manner would win the day, irked the Wanderers. It irked the police who questioned him, and it produced a disastrous effect on the jury. Marshal Hall had, of course, advised Seddon not to go into the witness box. He feared Seddon's conceit. He was right. All Marshal Hall's eloquence, his skilled advocacy, and the wiles which saved so many innocent people and a good many murderers too in the first quarter of the 20th century, could not overcome the obvious defects of Seddon's character. His naked avarice, his miserly, obsessive pursuit of wealth, not of necessity but for its own sake, were all laid bare in court. He was a clever man. He has the distinction of being referred to by Marshal Hall as the ablest man I ever defended on the capital charge. But Marshal Hall also found him repugnant. "This is the blackest case I've ever been in," he said, and he had no doubts from start to finish that Seddon was guilty. Frederick Seddon had miscalculated. That precise, neat mind, so adept with columns of figures, which could calculate the risks of a certain investment and allow for a margin of error, had failed him. Not only did the evidence point convincingly at Seddon, but when 12 men of the jury observed him closely in the No. 1 court of the Old Bailey, they saw that here was a man with sufficient arrogance and meanness to carry out such an act. They gave the correct verdict in finding Frederick Seddon guilty of Eliza Barrow's murder, but their verdict was deficient in one notable respect, because they found Margaret Seddon to be innocent, and that she most certainly was not. The police had realized in December of 1911, while questioning Seddon and investigating the circumstances of Miss Barrow's murder, that Seddon could not have acted alone. Many of the circumstances relating to the systematic defrauding of Eliza Barrow, and almost all of those relating to her murder, required Margaret Seddon's involvement. Without her assistance, the case against Seddon amounted to little more than defrauding Barrow of her savings and property, and seeking to conceal the circumstances and matter of her death from her relations. He had neither purchased arsenic, nor could he be shown to have administered it, or even to have been alone in her presence at any time leading up to her death. All of these trails led directly to his wife, Margaret. But Mrs. Seddon gained by comparison with her husband's arrogance, his conceit. She was a sorry figure in court, cowed by the circumstances, and although her testimony mirrored every aspect of that given by her husband, the manner of its delivery and of her contrite figure in the dock beside that of her husband elicited sympathy, tended to reduce her culpability in the matter, where Seddons drew only ire and dislike. Perhaps the nature of the evidence, never wholly satisfactory in all respects, seemed too great a burden on which to hang two people for the price of one, and the fact of her being a mother of 5 children, one only a year old, may well have tilted the judicial scales in her favour. The Attorney General did not go after her with the same vigour as he did Seddon. He alluded to the possibility of her being found not guilty. Perhaps there was, consciously or unconsciously, on the part of the prosecutor and the judge and the jury, a willingness to contrive an acquittal for her. Yet the evidence against her, deficient in the matter of concealment and subordinate to that of her husband in swindling Miss Barrow of her property, is none the less wholly compelling in the matter of her murder. It was Mrs. Seddon who was accused by the Hookes, who initially shared Miss Barrow's rooms with her, of turning Eliza Barrow against them, and thus having them expelled from the house, effectively isolating Miss Barrow. It was Mrs. Seddon who had every reason to fear a living Eliza Barrow, because she had drawn 27 open cheques for £5 notes from her bank account, for the most part at different places, using a false name and address. She had even cashed another one 4 days after Miss Barrow's death, claiming most improbably that she had given Miss Barrow cash for it. She had escorted Miss Barrow to the bank to withdraw her £216 in gold sovereigns and change, which had then disappeared. She claimed not to have inquired of Miss Barrow why she was withdrawing such a large sum of money, £25,000 in today's terms, to keep in her room, which she clearly had no need of. She was a frugal woman who spent very little, dressed shabbily. She received £10 per month from her annuity, and Mrs. Seddon herself had cashed in the £5 notes regularly for her. Even when they looked in Miss Barrow's room following her death, Mrs. Seddon appeared to show no great puzzlement that all the money had disappeared, and that they found only £4 and 10 shillings. It was simply not believable. It was almost certainly Mrs. Seddon who dispatched Maggie to buy arsenic-laced flypapers from Thorley's chemist. Thorley was not mistaken in this, as Marshall Hall claimed. His daughter Mabel was friends with Maggie Seddon, and he was quite adamant it was her. And Mrs. Seddon it was who purchased more flypapers herself from Meacher's, the chemist, on the 4th or 5th of September. It was Mrs. Seddon who made all Eliza Barrow's meals for her after the 1st of September in the small kitchen on the top floor provided for Miss Barrow and Ernie Grant. She had complete control of her from that time up until the morning of her death on the 14th of September. It was Mrs. Seddon who gave her medicine. Ernie Grant said he had only seen Miss Barrow take her medicine herself on one occasion. She didn't want to take it. On all other occasions it was given to her by Margaret Seddon, and in this, it must be said, Margaret proved extraordinarily diligent. She took pains to insist a reluctant Miss Barrow take her medicine. So attentive were both Seddons in this that Seddon himself drank some of her effervescent medicine to demonstrate how it should be taken. Was there in either of these two people who had used Miss Barrow so thoroughly in the year she had been with them, leaving her just £4 10 shillings at the time of her death, was there anything at all to suggest they would be concerned for her health, or that they should care whether or not she took her medicine? There was not. The only conceivable reason they could have for such assiduous attention to this is that they were poisoning her. The medicine provided a cure not of Miss Barrow's ills, but of theirs. It removed, they thought, the danger she posed to them of the discovery of their fraud. And of course Miss Barrow was an eccentric, querulous woman of strange habits, who, having outlived her financial usefulness, now represented a perpetual burden to them. It was Mrs. Seddon who claimed that the pendant and chain and other items had been given to her and to her daughter Maggie as Christmas presents and birthday gifts by Eliza Barrow. Even the watch treasured by Miss Barrow, because it had belonged to her own mother, had apparently been given to Mrs. Seddon. That Miss Barrow, who wore shabby clothes because of her thrift, should have willingly shown such largesse to the Seddon family is quite absurd. In all aspects of the murder, which had begun with Miss Barrow's isolation, had proceeded with the appropriation of her property, through to her illness and death, Mrs. Seddon was in absolute lockstep with her husband. The acts of both husband and wife were inextricably intertwined. If one was to be found guilty, the other, by implication and necessity, must be also. Marshall Hall's appeal before Justice Darling on the 1st of April pointed this out. Either both were guilty or both were innocent. Judge Darling observed quite tellingly on that occasion that we shall agree that women are treated more leniently. That was even acknowledged obliquely by Judge Thomas Bucknell in his summing up, when he appeared to acknowledge Mrs. Seddon's possible involvement in the actions to defraud Miss Barrow. The Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs, hinted that the jury might not find Mrs. Seddon guilty, and the police report, following the trial, held in the National Archives, states, "The verdict is illogical. Frederick Seddon's wife should, and before a less emotional and sentimental judge would, have been rightly convicted." It was illogical. Mrs. Seddon was as guilty as her husband, and it seems, on careful reflection, that it is far more likely that she administered the poison in Miss Barrow's medicine than her husband did. He did not give Miss Barrow her medicine. It would have been odd had he done so. The only person who administered this to her was Mrs. Seddon. If Seddon was the avaricious, beady-eyed instigator of the crime, then his wife was its chief prosecutor. As she procured the poison, she administered it to her food or drink or medicine. She had the means and opportunity which Seddon did not. Eliza Barrow's death was surely attributable to both of them. But it was Margaret Seddon who tended her patient with such attentive care, and who proved at the end to be an angel of death. There can be little doubt that Mrs. Seddon was guilty of the murder of Eliza Barrow, but she was given the benefit of the small amount of latitude the jury could afford in the case. She gained by comparison to her husband's arrogance. He drew the ire of the judge and jury by his brazen callousness, his meanness in all his actions, which even Marshall Hall called repugnant. Mrs. Seddon benefited from this. The case against her was, by a stretch, not proven, and Margaret Seddon almost certainly got away with murder. After Frederick Seddon was hanged at Pentonville Prison on the 18th of April 1912, Margaret returned with the 5 children to Liverpool. She sold her story to the Weekly Dispatch on the 17th of November 1912, and to several other newspapers too, in which she made a statement saying she had seen her husband administer the poison from the flypapers, and that he had threatened to blow her brains out with a revolver if she breathed a word of it. She said she kept silent for the sake of the children. But the tale is pure fiction, filled with discrepancies and wild improbabilities, and in any case she sold another story, retracting her confession soon afterwards. The Seddons were professional liars. Margaret Seddon was not sentimental, and her tears dried quickly. She grieved for the loss of her husband for 6 months, and then, on the 4th of November 1912, she married James Donald Cameron at St. Cleopa's Church, Toxteth, in Liverpool. The following month, on the 12th of December 1912, the family sailed for Boston, Massachusetts, under the name of Budge. They settled in Providence, Rhode Island, where Margaret had 3 more children, and then retired to Connecticut in 1945. The Camerons lived unobtrusive lives of quiet oblivion. None of Margaret Cameron's neighbours seemed to have known that she had been tried for murder at the Old Bailey in London in 1912. Frederick Seddon liked nothing better than to count his money, to add up the figures in the basement office at 63 Tollington Park each evening, to calculate his profits and losses. But there is always a reckoning. Frederick Seddon made his on the 18th of April 1912. It was to be another 51 years before Margaret Seddon made hers, and that reckoning came to her in Manchester, Connecticut, on the 29th of December 1963, at the age of 86.